Put your hands where I can see them. The officer's voice cut through the chatter of students in the crowded high school hallway. At first, it felt like a mistake, like he was talking to someone else. But the second time he barked the order, it was clear who he meant. She froze, clutching the straps of her backpack, surrounded by the wide-eyed stares of classmates who began pulling out their phones. Whispers turned into murmurs, then silence. The officer's eyes locked on her like a predator cornering prey. I said hands up. She couldn't move. Her voice trembled. What did I do? I didn't do anything. But he didn't listen. He didn't even hesitate. In seconds, he was on her, grabbing her arm and shoving her against the cold metal lockers as gasps filled the air. You match the description, he hissed. Her breath caught. What description? I was just walking to class. Don't talk back. His grip tightened. Resisting will only make this worse. A sharp pain shot through her wrist as he twisted it behind her back, snapping handcuffs around it with a brutal click. Stop! The cry erupted from her throat, raw and desperate. She searched the crowd for help, but no one stepped forward. Phones pointed at her. Some faces looked sympathetic, others indifferent, but no one moved. The officer didn't care about her protests, or the tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. You people think you can just walk around like you own the place, he muttered under his breath. Not today. Her world spun. Her knees buckled, but he held her up, dragging her down the hallway as if she were some criminal, parading her in front of every classmate, every teacher, everyone. Her heart pounded. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain in her wrists. And then, he turned the corner. That's when her father saw her. He was standing there, just a few feet away. Tall. Calm. But something about the way his eyes locked onto the officer froze everything. What the hell is this? His voice was sharp, controlled, but dangerous. The officer didn't even blink. She was caught trespassing. Suspicious behavior. Trespassing. The word hung in the air, heavy and venomous. In her own school. Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you. Her father didn't move. He stepped closer. The officer's hand drifted toward his taser. You don't know who I am, do you? The officer hesitated, but only for a moment. I don't care who you are. You should, her father said, low and steady. Something changed in the air, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. The officer's grip on her loosened just enough for her to breathe. But he didn't let go. You're obstructing an investigation, the officer said, his voice faltering now. And you're about to obstruct your entire career. The words hit hard, sharp and final. The officer's eyes darted between her father and the growing crowd, but it was too late. Whatever confidence he had was gone. But the damage was already done. She stood there, wrists bruised, humiliated in front of everyone she knew. Her father's voice filled the space, but her mind was stuck replaying the moment she was dragged through the hall. The laughter. The whispers. The humiliation. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, her father pulled out his badge. FBI. The officer's face drained of color. The tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too tight, but this was far from over. What happened next, what her father did to make sure the officer paid for what he had done, left the entire town in shock. The question is, how far would a father go to protect his daughter? And how much is too far when justice hangs in the balance? Hello, and welcome to Plow of Twist. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to address something important. This channel stands firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. We believe in equality, justice, and respect for all individuals, regardless of their race or background. If you've ever faced injustice or prejudice, know that your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard. Today's story highlights the fight for justice and accountability, and we hope it inspires strength and courage in all of you. Now, sit back, enjoy the story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support us. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. The morning sun spilled through the windows of the two-story colonial-style home, warming the polished wooden floors and highlighting the carefully framed photographs lining the hallway. The house sat in one of the quieter neighborhoods on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, a place where manicured lawns and neighborhood barbecues gave the illusion of safety and unity. But behind the curtains and freshly painted fences, tension simmered in ways that no one ever talked about openly. Inside the house, James Carter adjusted his tie in the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, calm, composed, and every bit the authoritative figure his career demanded. James was in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that often drew attention whether he was in uniform or not. But it wasn't the badge that defined him. It was the way he carried himself, with quiet confidence and an intensity that only deepened when his daughter, Maya, entered the room. Maya, 16, was the perfect blend of her parents. She had her mother's warm eyes and soft curls, but James's sharp focus and determination. Her confidence, however, hadn't come easily. Growing up as one of the few black students in her mostly white private school had taught her how to stay guarded. She was smart, articulate, and passionate, but James knew that being exceptional didn't always shield her from judgment, it sometimes made her a target. "Are you ready?" James asked, turning to face her as she stood in the doorway. Maya hesitated, adjusting the straps on her backpack. "I guess," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. James studied her for a moment. "You'll be fine. Just keep your head up. If anyone gives you trouble, I'll handle it," she interrupted, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. James wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the world was better than it had been when he was growing up. But he also knew better than to ignore the warning signs, the subtle shifts in the way people looked at her, the comments she pretended didn't bother her, the way she sometimes came home quieter than she left. His job as an FBI agent meant he had seen more than most parents ever would. He had investigated hate crimes, corruption, and cover-ups. He had fought for justice in courtrooms and back alleys alike. But none of that mattered now. Right now, he was just a father sending his daughter to school and hoping the world wouldn't break her spirit before she had the chance to shine. Maya grabbed her phone off the counter and kissed her dad on the cheek before heading out the door. She wasn't nervous about her history exam or the debate team meeting after school. She was nervous about the way eyes always seemed to follow her in the hallways, as if she didn't belong, as if every step she took was a challenge to the unwritten rules of the school's social hierarchy. The school itself was pristine, gleaming floors, spotless lockers, and banners hanging from the ceiling celebrating sports victories and academic achievements. But no amount of polish could hide the cracks beneath the surface. The stares started as soon as Maya walked in, just like they always did. It didn't matter that she was one of the top students in her class. It didn't matter that her father was a federal agent or that her mother was a respected attorney. None of it mattered because all they saw was her skin. She kept her head high, pushing through the hallways with practiced indifference. She knew the game: don't react, don't give them an excuse. But today, something felt different. There was tension in the air, an undercurrent of hostility that she couldn't quite place. And then it happened. The school resource officer, Officer Bradley Walker, stepped in front of her just as she reached her locker. He was in his mid-30s, stocky, with a buzz cut and a perpetual scowl that seemed carved into his face. Maya had noticed the way he watched her before, the way his eyes lingered too long, sizing her up like she didn't belong. "Empty your bag," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of the students nearby. Maya froze. "What?" "I said, empty your bag. Now." Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the straps. "Why?" "You match the description of someone reported for suspicious activity." Now do as I say. Maya's stomach twisted. She looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would step in. But they just stared. Some whispered, others smirked, and a few recorded on their phones. I didn't do anything, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Bradley stepped closer. Do you really want to argue with me right now? The weight of his presence crushed the air out of her lungs. She knew what would happen if she resisted, she had seen enough videos to know how these situations ended. Still, she couldn't make herself move. I said now, he barked, reaching for her bag. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm and yanked it, spinning her around and slamming her against the lockers. Gasps echoed through the hallway. Tears burned in Maya's eyes, but she bit them back. You're hurting me. Stop resisting. Bradley snapped, pulling out his handcuffs. Maya's mind raced. How did this happen? How did it escalate so fast? Her heart pounded as she fought to stay calm, but her thoughts kept spiraling. This couldn't be real. And then she saw him. Her father. He was at the end of the hallway, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. For the first time in her life, Maya saw something in his expression that terrified her. Pure, controlled rage. James moved quickly, but not recklessly. He didn't yell or push his way through the crowd. He didn't need to. The weight of his presence alone seemed to part the students like waves. Bradley didn't notice him at first. He was too busy fastening the cuffs around Maya's wrists. Excuse me, James said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Bradley turned, annoyed. Step back, James reached into his coat and pulled out his badge. FBI. The hallway fell silent. Bradley's face paled, but he didn't let go of Maya. Not yet. James's eyes never left him. I'm only going to ask this once. What the hell do you think you're doing to my daughter? For the first time, Bradley hesitated. But the damage was already done. Maya stood there, wrists bruised, tears threatening to spill, humiliated in front of everyone she knew. And her father, calm, calculating, and furious, was about to show the entire school, and the world, exactly what happens when you cross the wrong man. The hallway was still buzzing with whispers and scattered murmurs as James stepped closer, his eyes locked on Officer Bradley. Maya's wrists were red from the tightness of the cuffs, and the sheer humiliation painted across her face made James's stomach churn. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm, but the storm inside him was impossible to contain. Bradley's hand lingered on Maya's arm, as if he was still trying to assert control, and James noticed it immediately. Let her go. Bradley hesitated. I said, let her go. There was a crack in Bradley's confidence now, but he tried to cover it up with authority. Sir, I need you to step back. This is police business. James stepped even closer, his voice lowering but gaining weight with every word. And I'm giving you one chance to avoid the worst mistake of your career. Take the cuffs off. Now the tension in the hallway grew heavier, but Bradley didn't budge. Instead, he tightened his grip on Maya's arm, his voice sharp. I have reason to believe she's involved in criminal activity. Her behavior was suspicious. She refused to cooperate. James's eyes darkened, but his tone remained steady. Suspicious? She's a 16-year-old girl walking to class. What part of that is suspicious? Bradley's grip faltered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I don't need to explain myself to you. James took another step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Actually, you do. Because I'm not just her father. I'm a federal agent, and right now you're not just violating her rights, you're exposing this school and your entire department to a lawsuit that will tear your career apart. Bradley blinked, and for the first time, doubt crossed his face. But before he could speak, Maya's trembling voice broke through. Dad, please just get me out of here. James's heart twisted at the desperation in her voice, but he refused to let emotion cloud his focus. He turned back to Bradley. Last chance. Take the cuffs off. After a long, tense moment, Bradley finally pulled out the key, fumbling slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. Maya rubbed her wrists, her eyes darting nervously to the crowd that had gathered. James stepped between her and Bradley, his towering frame making it clear that this confrontation wasn't over. "You'll regret this," Bradley hissed under his breath, just loud enough for James to hear. James leaned in closer, his voice calm but sharp as a knife. "No, you will." The crowd began to disperse as the principal finally arrived, flustered and out of breath. "Mr. Carter, what is going on here?" James didn't even look at him. "We'll discuss this later. For now, I'm taking my daughter home." Maya followed him out, her hands trembling as she clutched her backpack. She didn't say a word until they reached the car. "Dad," they were all staring. They saw everything. James started the engine, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "I know. What are you going to do?" His eyes stayed on the road, but there was something in his voice that made her shiver. "I'm going to make sure this never happens again." The ride home was quiet, but the weight of what had happened hung between them like a storm cloud. When they pulled into the driveway, Maya finally spoke. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" James turned off the car and looked at her. "Do you want me to?" She shook her head, but her voice was soft. "No." James exhaled slowly, his mind already racing through the steps he needed to take. He couldn't let Bradley get away with this. Not just for Maya's sake, but for every other kid who might face the same treatment. The next morning, James wasn't in his usual suit. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, but the look in his eyes was sharper than ever. He kissed Maya on the forehead before she left for school, his voice firm. "I'll pick you up after class." "Stay strong." Maya nodded, but her stomach twisted as she walked back into the building. Whispers followed her down the hall, and she felt the weight of every glance. "Did you see what happened yesterday?" "I heard her dad some big shot agent. She's probably going to get the officer fired." The rumors spread faster than wildfire, and Maya tried to block them out. But when she saw Bradley standing at the end of the hallway, his eyes locked on hers, she knew this wasn't over. By lunchtime, she found herself in the principal's office. Her father was already there, standing across from Bradley and the principal. The tension in the room was suffocating. Bradley's voice was tight. "This is getting blown out of proportion." "I was following procedure." James's voice cut through him like a blade. "Is that what you call it? Assaulting a minor in front of an entire school?" The principal cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Carter, we're looking into the incident, but we need time to know." James's voice was sharp. "You don't need time. You need accountability. And you're going to get it." Bradley crossed his arms. "You think you can come in here and intimidate me just because you're FBI?" James stepped closer. "No. I'm going to hold you accountable because that's what justice looks like. And trust me, you're not ready for what's coming." Maya's heart raced as she watched her father, the calm intensity in his voice sending chills down her spine. She had never seen him like this, so controlled, so focused. As the meeting ended, Bradley's confidence seemed to crumble, but he didn't back down completely. His glare lingered on James, and there was something unspoken in his eyes. But James didn't flinch. When they left the office, Maya looked up at her father. "What now?" James's voice was steady, but there was a fire in his eyes. "Now we make sure everyone sees exactly who he really is." Maya swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She didn't know what her father had planned, but she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. And whatever came next was going to change everything. James sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his hands folded tightly in front of him, his knuckles white from the pressure. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Across the table, Officer Bradley leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed defensively, trying to mask the unease that had begun to creep into his posture. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow that highlighted the tension carved into every line of Bradley's face. He was sweating, but he didn't move to wipe it away. Instead, he stared at James with a mixture of defiance and desperation, as though trying to convince himself that he still had the upper hand. "You think this is going to scare me?" Bradley's voice carried an edge that cracked slightly under the weight of the room's silence. "I've been on the force for 10 years. I know how this works." James didn't flinch. His eyes never left Bradley's, his gaze steady and unrelenting. "Oh, I know you do. That's exactly why we're here right now. You've spent 10 years hiding behind that badge, bullying people, pushing them down because you thought no one would ever push back. But today, you pushed too far." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he tried to mask it with a smirk that didn't quite land. "Different how?" James leaned in just enough to make Bradley straighten his back instinctively, his voice lowering but gaining weight with each carefully measured word. "Different because this time, you picked the wrong person to mess with. This time, you didn't just go after another kid you thought didn't matter. You went after my daughter. And now you're going to find out exactly what happens when someone like me decides he's done playing by your rules." Bradley's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly covered it up with a defensive scoff. "What are you even talking about?" James's hand moved slowly but deliberately as he slid a thick folder across the table, the sound of paper scraping against metal filling the air. "Go ahead. Open it." Bradley hesitated. His fingers hovered over the folder, but when James didn't look away, he finally flipped it open. His eyes moved quickly at first, scanning the pages like he expected to find something he could dismiss. But then his movements slowed. His breathing changed. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He flipped another page. And another. His confidence cracked, and for the first time since this had started, real fear flickered across his face. "These are lies." "No." James's voice was sharp, cutting through Bradley's denial before it could take root. "These are facts. Every complaint that was filed against you. Every report that got buried. Every excessive force incident you thought you covered up. It's all in there, Bradley. Everything you've done that you thought no one would find is sitting in front of you right now. And here's the thing, you're not the only one who has it. I sent copies to Internal Affairs, my lawyers, and the press. So go ahead. Keep pretending this isn't real. It won't change what's coming." Bradley snapped the folder shut, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges. "You can't do this. I already did. You don't get it. If this goes public, my career, your career." James's voice hardened, each word landing with the weight of a hammer. "You think I give a damn about your career? My daughter stood in front of her classmates yesterday with her arms twisted behind her back like a criminal because you decided to flex your authority. You think I care about your career after that? After everything you've done to people who didn't have the power to fight back?" Bradley pushed back from the table, pacing now like a cornered animal. His steps were quick, restless, but there was nowhere to go in the small room. He turned sharply, his voice rising. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You're acting like I'm some kind of monster because your kid had a bad day." James stood slowly, his frame towering over Bradley's. His voice dropped, low and dangerous. "Don't you dare minimize what you did. Don't you dare try to spin this. You didn't just humiliate her. You violated her. You targeted her. And you're only scared now because someone finally has the power to hold you accountable." Bradley's pacing stopped abruptly, but his voice cracked as he spoke. "Look, I messed up, okay? I see that now. But I've got a family. I've got kids. You can't destroy everything I've built over one mistake." James didn't waver. "One mistake?" His voice carried a dangerous edge. "How many mistakes, Bradley? How many times did you get away with this because the people you hurt didn't have anyone to stand up for them? How many times did you walk away without consequences? You're not a victim. You're not a man who made one mistake. You're a man who thought no one would ever call you out for the things you did. And now, the truth is out. Bradley's shoulders sagged as he sank back into the chair, the bravado draining from his body. His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. So what happens now? James didn't hesitate. Now, you lose everything you thought made you untouchable. Your badge, your title, your reputation. And the people you hurt? They finally get justice. The door opened behind them, and two men in dark suits entered, flanking the precinct's captain. Bradley's eyes darted to them, his panic fully visible now. The men addressed him formally, instructing him to stand. Bradley opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. James stepped back, watching as the officer who had humiliated his daughter was led out of the room. Bradley's voice broke as he tried to speak, but the weight of the evidence against him made it clear that there was nothing left to say. When the door closed, James exhaled, his shoulders easing slightly. But there was no relief in his expression. He knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. He pulled out his phone, dialing quickly. "It's done," he said when Maya answered on the other end. "But this is far from over." Maya's voice was soft but steady. "I know." James looked down the empty hallway, the echoes of Bradley's protests still lingering faintly in the air. He wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The system that allowed this kind of abuse wasn't going to fix itself, and James wasn't about to walk away now. Whatever came next, he was ready for it. And he wasn't going to stop until the people who thought they were untouchable finally learned what it felt like to face consequences. James stepped out of the precinct, his footsteps echoing sharply in the empty corridor. The air outside felt heavier than it should have, even as the sun pressed down against his skin. His hands curled into fists at his sides, not out of anger but out of the sheer weight of everything that had just unfolded. It wasn't over. Not yet. He could still feel the tension rolling off his shoulders, the echo of Bradley's panicked voice bouncing around his head. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Maya was waiting in the car when he reached the parking lot. Her eyes darted to his face the moment he opened the door, searching for something, reassurance, answers, maybe even justice. She didn't say anything at first, but the questions were written all over her expression. "Is it done?" James slid into the driver's seat, his voice steady but heavy. It started. Her fingers twisted together nervously in her lap. "What does that mean?" "It means he's off the streets." For now. Maya's breath caught, her voice rising slightly. "For now. That's it? After everything he did? He gets to walk away?" James turned to her, his voice firm but gentle. "He's not walking away. He's facing charges, and he's going to lose his badge. But this doesn't end with him, Maya. It never did." She looked down at her hands, the frustration clear in her voice. "It doesn't feel like enough." James reached over, resting his hand on hers. "It's not. But this is how it starts. It starts by tearing down people like him, one piece at a time, until there's nothing left for them to hide behind." Maya's voice softened, but the edge of anger was still there. "And what if it's not enough? What if they just replace him with someone else exactly like him?" James's jaw tightened as he stared straight ahead. "Then we keep going." The drive home was quiet, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they hadn't said yet, every unspoken fear, every unanswered question. Maya leaned her head against the window, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. She could still feel the weight of the cuffs around her wrists, the heat of the stairs in the hallway. When they pulled into the driveway, she didn't get out right away. Her voice broke the stillness. "Do you think it's ever going to change?" James's voice was low, steady. "I think it has." To the next morning, James was already up before Maya. He was at the dining table, papers and files spread out in front of him, his phone buzzing with constant notifications. Maya lingered in the doorway, watching him as he worked, his focus so sharp it was almost intimidating. "Are you going after the department now?" James looked up, his expression softening slightly. "I'm making sure this doesn't just go away." Maya hesitated before stepping closer. And what if it does? What if people just forget? They won't. Not this time. Maya sat down across from him, her voice quieter now. And what about me? What do I do now? You keep going. You keep walking into that school with your head held high. You don't let them take anything else from you. Her voice trembled. But what if it happens again? James leaned forward, his voice steady and deliberate. Then we fight again. And again. Until there's nothing left for them to take. Later that day, James received a call. Bradley had posted bail and was released pending trial. The news hit like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, James just stood there, his phone still pressed to his ear as if he hadn't heard it right. Maya saw the change in his face the moment he hung up. What happened? James hesitated. Bradley's out. Maya's voice rose, sharp and angry. What? Are you serious? After everything you did? After everything he did? James held up a hand to calm her, but the fire in her eyes didn't die down. It's not over. This doesn't mean he's free. It means he's scared. And scared people make mistakes. Maya's voice cracked. He's not scared. He's just going to keep doing what he's always done because he knows he can get away with it. James's voice dropped, calm but heavy. Not this time. That evening, James was back at the precinct. He didn't wear his badge this time. He didn't need to. He walked in with purpose, his presence commanding attention without a single word. Bradley was still there, clearing out his desk under the watchful eyes of two officers. When he saw James, his movements slowed, his hands faltering as he shoved papers into a box. What do you want? James didn't move closer, but his voice carried across the room with enough weight to make Bradley's shoulders stiffen. I want you to understand something. You're done. Not just here. Everywhere. Every department in the state is going to know your name, and not for the reasons you want. You're not just losing your job. You're losing the life you built on other people's fear. Bradley turned sharply, his voice cracking. You think this makes you better than me? You think ruining me fixes anything? James's voice didn't waver. No, but it's a start. Bradley stepped closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. You don't know what it's like out there. You don't know what it takes to keep control. James's expression hardened. Control? Is that what you call what you did to my daughter? That wasn't control. That was fear. And the only reason you're afraid now is because you finally ran out of people to hide behind. Bradley's voice shook as he took another step forward. I made a mistake. No. James's voice cut through him like a knife. A mistake is forgetting someone's name. What you did was a choice. And now you're going to pay for it. Bradley's shoulders slumped as the last shred of defiance drained from his face. James didn't wait for him to speak again. He turned and walked away, leaving Bradley standing in the middle of the precinct with nothing but a box of papers and the weight of everything he'd lost. When James got back to the car, Maya was waiting. She didn't need to ask what happened. She could see it in the way he carried himself, in the way his shoulders finally seemed a little lighter. Is it over? James looked at her, his voice steady but certain. Not yet. But it's close, and for the first time in days, Maya felt like she could breathe. James sat in his home office, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Papers were scattered across the desk, documents, emails, transcripts, all evidence of the damage Bradley had left in his wake. But James wasn't looking at any of it. His eyes were fixed on his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen as if the message he had drafted might somehow rewrite itself. It was a statement, carefully worded but heavy with meaning, ready to be sent to the press. Yet something about it felt final in a way that unsettled him. Maya knocked softly on the door, peeking her head inside before stepping in. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down in the chair across from him, her eyes scanning the mess of papers. Her voice was quiet but steady. What happens now? James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as he rubbed his temple. Now we wait. Internal Affairs is going to push forward with the investigation, and the media is already circling. But it's not just about Bradley anymore. It's bigger than him. Maya's eyes stayed locked on him. What if it's not enough? What if it never is? James looked at her, his expression softening. It's never enough, Maya. Not for what he did. Not for what people like him have done for years. But it's a start. And sometimes, a start is all we get. Her voice cracked slightly. But what if he gets away with it? He won't. James's voice was firm, but there was an edge to it that hinted at his own doubts. He won't because I won't let him. Maya leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. But what if it doesn't change anything? What if all this attention just makes people hate us more? James's gaze didn't waver. Then we keep fighting. Maya sat back, her shoulders slumping slightly as she ran her fingers through her hair. I just don't want to be afraid anymore. James's voice softened. You won't have to be. Not while I'm here. The next day, the first headlines started to appear. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting footage of Bradley's arrest and highlighting the accusations against him. Interviews with former students, parents, and community members painted a grim picture, one of abuse, fear, and silence that had gone unchecked for too long. But as the coverage grew, so did the backlash. James scrolled through the comments online, his jaw tightening with every accusation. People called him a liar, an agitator, an opportunist. Others defended Bradley, claiming he was just doing his job, that he had been unfairly targeted. Some even went as far as to say Maya had provoked the incident, twisting the narrative to make her the villain. Maya noticed the change in him almost immediately. You're reading the comments, aren't you? James looked up, guilt flashing across his face before he set the phone down. I'm just keeping track of the response. Her voice was sharp. Don't. You told me not to read them, so you shouldn't either. James rubbed his hands together, the tension in his shoulders refusing to let go. It's different for me. Maya's voice rose. How? How is it different? They're talking about me too. They're making me out to be the bad guy, and I can't even defend myself. But you can. James's voice lowered. It's my job to protect you. And what about protecting yourself? The words hit harder than James expected, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Maya stood, pacing the room. You can't keep carrying this on your own. It's not just your fight. It's mine too. James's voice softened. I know that. But you shouldn't have to carry this weight. Not at your age. Maya stopped, turning to face him. But I do. I already am. James stood, closing the distance between them. And that's what I'm trying to stop. Her voice cracked. But what if you can't? James reached out, resting his hands on her shoulders. Then we keep going. No matter how long it takes. That night, James received a call from one of his contacts at Internal Affairs. Bradley had agreed to a plea deal, avoiding trial in exchange for a dishonorable discharge and a permanent ban from law enforcement. He would lose his pension, his badge, and any hope of rebuilding his career. But there would be no jail time. James hung up the phone, his chest tight as he walked into the living room where Maya was curled up on the couch. She looked up the moment she saw him, her eyes searching his face for answers. What happened? James hesitated before sitting down next to her. He took the deal. He's out for good. But no jail time. Maya's expression fell. So he gets to walk away? Not exactly. He loses everything that gave him power. But yeah, he walks. Maya's voice trembled. That's not fair. No, it's not. She turned away, wiping her eyes quickly before James could see the tears. Then what was the point of all this? James reached for her hand, his voice gentle but steady. The point is that he's not in that school anymore. He's not hurting anyone else. And the point is that we showed people they don't have to be afraid to speak up. Maya's voice was barely above a whisper. But it still feels like he won. James shook his head. He didn't win. He lost everything. And the only reason he's not behind bars is because we made sure the world knows who he really is. He'll never wear a badge again. He'll never hurt another kid again. And the next time someone like him tries to do what he did, they'll think twice. Maya swallowed hard, nodding slowly. But James could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes, and he knew it wouldn't fade overnight. As the days passed, the media attention slowly shifted to other stories, but the impact of what happened didn't fade. Parents started showing up at school board meetings, demanding changes in policies and accountability for the officers stationed in schools. Activists began organizing events, using Maya's story as a rallying cry for reform. James watched it all unfold, knowing the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like they had made a dent, small, but real. And as he looked at Maya, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Strength. James stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as he stared at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but his thoughts were loud, too loud to push away. He could still hear Maya's voice from the night before, the anger and disappointment layered in her words, and it weighed heavier than he wanted to admit. He had done everything he could to make sure Bradley would never wear a badge again, yet somehow, it didn't feel like enough. It felt unfinished, like there was still something left hanging in the air, something unresolved. Maya's footsteps broke through the silence, and when James looked up, she was already standing at the doorway. She looked tired, like the weight of everything had pressed down so hard it drained the light out of her eyes. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside and sitting down at the table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wooden surface. "Did you sleep?" James shook his head. "Not really, neither did I." He waited for her to say more, but when she didn't, he stepped closer, his voice softer now. "It's okay to feel this way, Maya. It's okay to be angry." Maya's voice came out sharper than she intended. "I don't want to be angry. I just want to feel normal again. I don't want to walk into that school and feel like everyone is staring at me, wondering if I'm the girl who got a cop fired. I don't want to keep seeing his face every time I close my eyes." James pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "It's not going to feel normal right away. What happened to you, what he did to you, that doesn't just disappear overnight. But you're not alone in this. I'm not going anywhere." Maya's eyes met his for the first time, and there was a flicker of vulnerability there, a glimpse of the girl who had always tried so hard to be strong, even when she was breaking inside. "But what if it happens again? What if someone else does the same thing? Or worse?" James reached across the table, his hand resting on top of hers. "Then we fight again. We keep fighting until people like him are too afraid to try this ever again. You don't have to carry this alone, Maya. I'll carry it with you." Her voice dropped. "But it still hurts, I know." Maya looked down, her fingers tightening around his. "What if they're right? What if I did something wrong? What if I made it worse by not just listening to him?" James's voice hardened. "Don't ever think that. Don't let him or anyone else make you feel like this was your fault. What he did was wrong, and nothing you could have said or done would have justified it. He was wrong, Maya. And no matter how loud the people defending him get, they can't change that." Maya swallowed hard, nodding slowly, but James could tell the doubt was still there, clinging to her like a shadow. He squeezed her hand gently, willing her to believe the words he was saying even if she couldn't quite feel them yet. Later that day, James found himself at his desk again, staring at the screen as emails poured in. Some were messages of support, but others were filled with threats and accusations. He closed his laptop, leaning back in his chair as exhaustion tugged at him. He had known this fight wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected it to feel this personal. The sound of the doorbell pulled him out of his thoughts. Maya was already halfway to the door by the time he got up, and when she opened it, a woman stood on the porch. She was older, with lines around her eyes that hinted at years of worry and strength. She introduced herself as Angela, the mother of one of Maya's classmates, and her eyes softened when she saw Maya standing there. "I just wanted to stop by and say thank you. For standing up. For speaking out. My son told me what happened, and I'm sorry you had to go through that." Maya blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected support. "Thank you." Angela's voice wavered slightly. "My nephew went through something similar a few years ago. He didn't have anyone to fight for him like you did. He didn't have someone like your dad. I just wanted you to know that what you did, it mattered." James stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know." Angela nodded, her eyes lingering on Maya for a moment longer before she stepped back. "If you ever need anything at all, you let me know." Maya closed the door, her expression unreadable as she turned back to James. "Do you think there are more people like her?" James smiled faintly. "I know there are." The days that followed felt like a blur of interviews, phone calls, and meetings. James found himself balancing his role as a father with his role as an advocate, constantly pushing for more accountability, more oversight, more reform. But it wasn't easy. Every victory felt like it came with another fight, and every step forward seemed to stir up even more resistance. Maya watched it all unfold, torn between admiration for her father's determination and frustration at how slow progress felt. She wanted closure, but the more she saw of the process, the more she realized how complicated justice really was. One night, as James sat on the couch with files spread out in front of him, she finally said what had been on her mind for days. "What if this doesn't change anything?" James looked up, his expression unreadable. "It already has." Maya shook her head. "No, I mean really change. What if people just forget? What if nothing actually gets better?" James's voice softened. "It's not about fixing everything all at once. It's about pushing forward, step by step, even when it feels impossible. Change doesn't happen overnight, Maya. But it does happen. And this? This is part of it." Maya's voice dropped. "I just want it to feel like it was worth it." James leaned forward, his voice firm but filled with warmth. "It was worth it. Because you're still standing. Because people are listening. And because no one is ever going to look at you the way Bradley did and think they can get away with it again." Maya's eyes softened, and for the first time in days, the weight on her shoulders seemed to lighten, even if only a little. James watched her carefully, knowing that the road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he felt like they were finally moving in the right direction. James sat on the porch, his elbows resting on his knees, staring out at the fading light of the evening sky. The hum of cicadas filled the air, but his mind was somewhere else, still tangled in the events of the past few weeks. He could feel Maya's presence before he saw her. She stepped outside quietly, sliding the door shut behind her, and sank into the chair beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just tucked her legs up and wrapped her arms around them, staring straight ahead the same way he was. After a long stretch of silence, her voice finally broke through the air. "It still doesn't feel real." James turned to look at her, his expression softening. "What doesn't?" "All of it. The way he looked at me that day. The way he grabbed me like I wasn't even a person. I keep replaying it in my head, and every time it's like I feel it all over again." James exhaled slowly. "Trauma doesn't go away just because we want it to. It lingers. But it doesn't mean you're weak, Maya. It means you're human." She rested her chin on her knees, her voice quieter now. "I don't want to keep feeling like this." "You won't. Not forever, but what if I do?" James reached over and placed his hand on her shoulder, giving it a light squeeze. "Then you talk to me. You talk to Mom. You let us help you carry it." Maya shook her head. "I don't want to keep talking about it. I just want to forget it ever happened." James's voice was steady but heavy. "You might never forget it. And maybe you shouldn't." Her head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "Why would I want to remember it?" "Because it's part of who you are now." It's part of your story. And as much as I hate what happened, I need you to see that what you do next matters even more. You survived it. And you're still standing. Maya swallowed hard, her voice trembling. I don't feel strong. You don't have to feel strong to be strong. She looked away again, her fingers tracing patterns along the edge of the chair. Do you think he even feels bad? James's jaw tightened, and he leaned back, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I think Bradley's the kind of man who's spent his whole life convincing himself he's right, even when he's wrong. I think he's more scared of losing everything than he is sorry for what he's done. But that's not your burden to carry. You don't need his apology to move forward. Maya's voice hardened. I want him to know what he did to me. I want him to feel it. He does. Trust me, Maya. He feels it every time someone looks at him and doesn't see the man he pretended to be. Every time someone whispers his name in disgust. He's already living with the consequences, but it's not enough. I know. It never feels like enough. Maya's shoulders slumped, and James could see the weight pressing down on her again. He leaned closer, his voice gentler now. You're not alone in this. And you don't have to keep pretending to be okay when you're not. Maya's voice cracked. I just don't know what to do with all of it. James nodded slowly. You don't have to know yet. You just have to keep going. One step at a time. She wiped her eyes quickly, as if trying to hide the tears before he could see them, but James didn't look away. He let her sit in it, let her feel what she needed to feel without rushing her past it. Later that night, James sat in the living room with Maya's mother, Christina. She was flipping through the news channels, pausing every time the case was mentioned. It felt surreal hearing strangers dissect their lives on television, analyzing every detail like it was just another story. Christina finally muted the TV and turned to James. Are we doing the right thing? James's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Pushing this so far. Making it so public. What if it makes things worse for her? What if it paints an even bigger target on her back? James rubbed his hands together, his voice low. I think about that every single day. But what's the alternative? Letting people like Bradley keep getting away with it? Letting Maya grow up thinking no one's ever going to stand up for her? Christina's voice softened. I just want her to be safe. So do I. But safe doesn't mean silent. She sighed, leaning back into the couch. I just hate that this is her reality now. That this is something she'll always carry with her. James looked toward the stairs, where Maya's door was still closed. She's stronger than we think. She's stronger than she thinks. Christina's voice trembled. I just don't want her to lose herself in this. I don't want her to carry this anger forever. Neither do I. But we can't control how long it takes for her to heal. All we can do is make sure she knows we're here. Christina nodded slowly, her eyes filling with unshed tears. James reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. The next day, James walked into the precinct again, this time not as a father seeking justice but as a federal agent prepared to push harder. He met with the chief, pushing for policy changes, new training programs, and stricter accountability measures. It wasn't just about Bradley anymore. It was about everyone who thought they could hide behind their badges. When he returned home, Maya was sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. She was typing furiously, her eyes sharp with determination. James leaned over her shoulder, scanning the screen. What's this? Her voice was steady but firm. A speech. For the school board meeting next week. If they're going to talk about me, they're going to hear my side too. James felt a surge of pride, but he kept his voice calm. Are you sure you're ready for that? No. But I'm doing it anyway. He smiled faintly. That's my girl. Maya's voice softened. Do you think it'll make a difference? James looked at her, his voice steady. I know it will. Maya nodded and turned back to her screen, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. For the first time in weeks, James felt like they weren't just reacting to what had happened. They were taking control of it. And as he watched Maya work, he knew this was only the beginning. The school board meeting was packed, the tension in the room palpable as voices murmured in hushed conversations. Parents, students, teachers, and reporters filled the seats, their eyes shifting toward the front of the room where Maya sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. James stood behind her, his presence steady and unshaken, but he didn't speak. This was Maya's moment, and she was ready to take it. The board chair cleared her throat, calling the room to order. Maya's name echoed through the speakers, and as she rose to approach the podium, the whispers quieted. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd, her heart pounding, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. "My name is Maya Carter, and until a few weeks ago, I thought my voice didn't matter. I thought no one would listen, no one would care, and no one would believe me. I was wrong." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm standing here today because I refuse to stay silent. I refuse to let what happened to me be dismissed or forgotten. And I refuse to let anyone else feel the way I felt that day, helpless, humiliated, and invisible." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room, but Maya didn't falter. She held her ground, her voice growing stronger. "What happened to me wasn't just about one officer. It wasn't just about a bad decision or a misunderstanding. It was about a system that allows people like him to feel untouchable. It was about a culture that teaches us to fear instead of trust. And it was about the way people look the other way because it's easier than admitting the truth." James watched her, his chest tightening with pride as Maya's words cut through the room. "But this isn't just my story. It's the story of every kid who's ever been targeted because of how they look, every parent who's ever had to teach their child how to survive an encounter instead of how to trust, and every person who's ever been made to feel like their life doesn't matter." She paused again, her voice trembling slightly but still holding firm. "I'm not here asking for sympathy. I'm here demanding accountability. I'm here asking you to stand with me and make sure this never happens to anyone else." The room erupted into applause, and Maya stepped back from the podium, her shoulders rising and falling with each breath. James placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her as the board members exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for the impact of her words. In the days that followed, the changes began. New policies were implemented in the school district, mandatory diversity training, stricter oversight of officers on campus, and a hotline for students to report incidents of misconduct. The press followed the story closely, and Maya's speech went viral, sparking conversations across the country. But the victory didn't erase the scars. Maya still flinched when she saw a police uniform. She still avoided certain hallways at school. And James knew it would take time for her to fully feel safe again. But she kept showing up. She kept speaking out. And with each step, her confidence grew stronger. As for Bradley, his disgrace was public and irreversible. He lost his badge, his pension, and his credibility. Job offers dried up, and he faced civil lawsuits from other families who came forward with their own stories. His name became a warning, a reminder of what happens when power is abused and accountability is ignored. James didn't feel satisfaction watching Bradley's downfall. What he felt was closure. Not because the system was fixed, but because it had bent, even if just a little, under the weight of truth. One afternoon, Maya came home to find James sitting on the porch, flipping through a stack of letters and emails. "What's all that?" "Letters from people who saw your speech. Parents, students, even teachers. A lot of them sharing their own stories. Some just thanking you for speaking up." Maya sank into the chair beside him, picking up one of the letters and scanning it quickly. "Do you think it's enough?" James turned to look at her, his voice steady. "It's never enough. But it's a start." Maya leaned back, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I think I can live with that." And she did. Over the next year, Maya became an advocate for school reform, speaking at events and working with local organizations to push for change. She didn't forget what happened, but she refused to let it define her. Instead, she used it to shape something bigger, something stronger than fear. James continued his work with the FBI, but something had shifted in him too. He approached every case with a sharper focus, a deeper resolve to fight the kind of injustice that nearly broke his family. He knew the battle was far from over, but he was more prepared than ever to face it. As the months passed, the noise began to fade. The headlines moved on, the reporters stopped calling, and life settled into a new rhythm. But the impact remained, echoing in quiet conversations, in small victories, and in the way Maya walked with her head held just a little higher than before. And now it's time to turn the focus back to you. How many times have you witnessed injustice and felt powerless to stop it? How many moments have passed where silence seemed easier than speaking up? This story isn't just about Maya or James or even Bradley. It's about all of us and the choices we make when we're faced with moments that demand courage. What would you have done in James's position? How far would you go to protect someone you love? And more importantly, what are you willing to do to make sure no one else has to fight the same battle? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this conversation going. And if this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power we all have to create change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.